Good morning, students. Welcome to history class. We are reading Feudalism in Medieval Europe. Today we are going to complete this unit. And in today's lesson we will read 7.11 to 7.13. In the last class we learned about feudal castles. In today's class we will learn about the duties of the residents of these castles. Who were the residents of these castles? Nobles or lords and their wives and their families. So in today's discussion, we will see first of all duties of the lords. While the king sat at the top of the hierarchy, medieval lords below him were tasked to defend the lands from attacks and hostile neighborhoods. In exchange of their loyalty and service, the medieval lord offered villagers protection and safety. One of the medieval lord's important duties was to serve the king, and he did so by paying him taxes and supplying him with his finest soldiers. They would also handle estate-related affairs by looking into financial, supply inventory and harvest reports. They settled complaints and disputed and granted the permission to marry. Medieval lords were active in political discussions and participated in decision-making process. Now, what were the duties of the ladies or noble women? The role of noble woman was important to the success of feudalism because they helped their husband run the estates. The lady became lord of the manor while her husband was off fighting. Sometimes women might even go too far to defend her estate if needed. However, her main duty was to give birth to her husband's son. Her duties also include supervising servants, performing medical tasks like to be doctor and nurse and visit the sick and poor, and they also managed house. Now, three estates of feudal age. Society in the feudal age was composed of three different classes or estates. The first estate was the clergy, meaning only the higher clergy. They lived a luxurious life and were usually corrupted. The second estate was the nobility. Land was the only source of fortune at that time, and land was the only yardstick for measuring the wealth of a lord. There was a constant conflict among the lords over the capture of lands. The third estate consisted of the rest of the people. Their duty was to labor in order to provide other two classes abundance and happiness. There was an unbridgeable gulf of social difference between the peasants and the lords. The history of the later period, however, deals primarily with the gradual rise of the third estate or the middle class. So, in this third estate belonged peasants. Now, in the feudal age, the peasants formed the largest section of the population. They were again divided into three categories: freeholders, villeins, and serfs. Freeholders received their lands from the lords, which they used as their own. They did not work for their lords, but they used to work for themselves. They just took the land from the lords. In return, they had to pay them tax. These were freeholders. Now, the second type was villeins. They received land from the lords to work for a fixed number of days, and in return, they gave the lords a part of the produce. The final section was called serfs. They were the peasants of the lowest category. If we can divide these peasants into three classes, then serfs comprised of the lowest section, and their miseries knew no bounds. They were totally at the beck and call of their lords. They were not free agents. They were tied to the lands, and their masters changed only if the land changed hands. They could not leave the land at their will. If they were caught while doing so, they were severely punished. They fared a little better than the ancient slaves in view of the fact that they could not be separated from the land and sold. Now, these serfs had lands which they cultivated for themselves, but they were compelled to cultivate lands entirely for their lords. They had to do forced labor, that is, without their consent, without their will, they had to work for the lords. The lords could call for their services whenever they liked, and they could not ask to be paid. So, unpaid labor. If the lord asks, they had to go. They cannot refuse. Or they could not even ask for the money for the work that they are doing. For their lands, they had to pay the lord a part of the produce. So you see, the serfs, that is the lowest category of the peasants, had a very miserable life. But they had no way to escape from their miserable existence. At times, some serf, unable to bear the torture of the lord, would run away to a town some distance away. But the lord himself or his men would go after them and bring them back. However, there are two methods in which they could escape their serfdom. What is the first method? If the runaway serf could keep away from his lord for a year and a day, he became a free man. Then the lord would lose his right or claim on him. And another method was, if a serf embraced a holy order, he was a free man, as no churchman was a serf. So you see that life of serfs were very miserable. They were tortured. They were forced to do work for their lord, and moreover they were not paid properly. So naturally there rose a tendency to revolt against the lords. So, persecuted beyond endurance, the peasants revolted. So, in history, you will find several such instances where peasants or the lower section of the people revolted or protested against the higher section or the higher classes, people of the higher classes. Two such revolts are mentioned over here. One that took place in France in 1358. This revolt was called Jacques Revolt. This was a popular revolt by peasants that took place in the northern France in the early summer of 1358 during Hundred Years' War. And another was Wat Tyler Revolt. This took place in England in 1381. Its immediate cause was the imposition of unpopular poll tax, which brought to a head the economic discontent that had been growing since the middle of the century. But one thing we must remember that initially these peasants were not successful because the higher class nobles, lords, they were more powerful. That's why these protests were put down with much cruelty. The rebellious peasants of England demanded that serfdom and the system of forced labor should be abolished and the taxes should be reduced. But they were put down. As the peasants were weak and disorganized, the revolts could not meet with success. But new ideas of equality were slowly spreading. The old idea of submission to authority, the basis of the feudal system, was breaking. Although these revolts were not successful, but we can say that it paved the way for many future revolts and protests. How? Because these revolts gave that first blow to the higher class people. So, with this, we complete this chapter, Feudalism in Medieval Europe. Now it's time for you to open your history book and read this section 7.11 to 7.13, and after reading that you have to do exercise 1, A1, A2 and A3 in your book, and exercise B and C in your history exercise book, and you have to submit this homework by email before 26/20, that is Saturday, this Saturday 20th June 2020. Before that you have to submit your work in that given mail ID. Thank you.